Across the green valleys and winding waters of the Niger, where the land breathes with the memory of generations, there was born a people whose story refuses to fade into the shadows. The Igbo, with their villages bound together by trust, consensus, and unyielding independence, carved their destiny in the soil of West Africa long before foreign sails darkened their horizon. They were not ruled by kings, but by the voices of elders and the will of the community, believing that the strength of the many outweighed the power of the few. Every market square rang with debate, every family compound carried the wisdom of ancestors, and every child grew under the banner of self-determination. Their world was one of vibrant trade, artistry, and the constant weaving of culture into daily life, a place where freedom was not a luxury but the breath they took. Yet history would test that breath. When foreign traders came not for gold or goods but for human beings, the Igbo found themselves at the center of a dark tide. Torn from their homeland, shackled in chains and herded into the bellies of ships, they carried with them more than sorrow. They carried the unbreakable code of who they were. The Niger River was no longer just a waterway. It became a silent witness to the stolen, the scattered, and the dreams deferred. Yet the chain could never hold the spirit it could not see. Across the Atlantic, in the brutal heat of the plantations and the suffocating hold of slavery, the Igbo legacy began to take root in unexpected soil. In the cane fields of the Caribbean and the cotton rows of the American South, their customs, their names, and their ways of thinking became seeds of resistance. They remembered the village councils where no single man could rule, and they carried that belief into their quiet rebellions and bold revolts. They remembered the proverbs of their elders, whispers that reminded them that a person's dignity was worth more than life itself. The story of Igbo landing stands as one of the most powerful testaments to this spirit. Faced with enslavement on the Georgia coast, they chose the waters over bondage, walking into the sea rather than bowing to the yoke. That act was not an end, but a declaration heard across centuries: freedom or nothing. And so in every corner of the New World where the Igbo were taken, they found ways to resist. Some through open revolt, others through the preservation of song, language, and ritual. Every lullaby sung to a child in the fields, every proverb passed in hushed tones, every secret gathering to dance or speak in their tongue, these were acts of defiance against erasure. Their culture, hidden in plain sight, was a quiet rebellion more enduring than any change. The Igbo belief in the equality of all souls became a hidden current in the rivers of abolition, flowing into movements that sought to dismantle slavery entirely. This was not just survival, it was transformation. In Haiti, Jamaica, Brazil, and the United States, echoes of the Igbo way of life shaped the philosophies of freedom fighters. Their communal approach to leadership, their insistence on personal autonomy, and their refusal to accept tyranny in any form became part of the moral fabric of liberation. Even stripped of their land, they became architects of resistance in lands that were not their own. The resilience of the Igbo is a testament to what it means to hold on to identity when the world conspires to erase. They adapted without surrendering, blending their traditions into the emerging cultures of the diaspora while keeping the heart of their heritage alive. In food, you could taste home. In rhythm, you could hear the heartbeat of the Niger. In resistance, you could feel the pulse of a people who never gave up. This endurance was not born from chance, it was a deliberate act of will. To be Igbo in a world that sought to strip that away was to declare daily that the self was sacred. In every generation, they taught their children the value of memory, for memory was their weapon against disappearance. They understood that as long as their stories were told, they had not been conquered. From the Niger to the New World, this thread of legacy weaves through time like a cord that will not snap. It binds the fisher of the river to the dockworker in Charleston, the market woman in Onset, to the street vendor in Port-au-Prince. It reminds the modern world that history is not just written in books, it is carried in blood, in the tilt of a chin, in the refusal to kneel. Today, when we speak of freedom, we must remember that it is built not only on grand victories but on the countless, often invisible acts of courage by people who decided that their dignity was worth any cost. The Igbo did not wait for the world to grant them their humanity, they lived it in defiance of the world's denial, and in that choice they became more than survivors, they became shapers of history itself. The lesson is clear. The forces that seek to erase identity have always been met by those who refuse to forget. The Igbo show us that to resist is to remember, and to remember is to win. The fields may have changed, the chains may have fallen, but the struggle for self-determination continues in new form. The legacy they left us is not just a history to honor, but a call to action. Wherever there is oppression, there is a choice to stand as they did, unyielding, unbroken, and unafraid. Their story tells us that freedom is never truly lost so long as there are those willing to live it even in the darkest of times. And so, from the Niger to the New World, the Igbo journey reminds us that the human spirit once committed to freedom cannot be changed. It will rise in every generation, sometimes as a whisper, sometimes as a roar, but always as a force that refuses to bow. This is the inheritance of the Igbo people, an inheritance that belongs not only to their descendants but to anyone who dares to believe that dignity is worth more than life itself. It is the unbroken line between past and present, between river and ocean, between the land we come from and the future we are building. It is proof that the soul of a people once awakened can cross any seas, survive any storm, and still stand tall in the sun. The story of identity as resistance in the Igbo journey is not a tale of passive endurance, but an unyielding fight to remain whole when everything was designed to break them. Torn from the heart of their ancestral homeland along the Niger, the Igbo were thrust into ships, their names stripped, their languages forbidden, and their gods ridiculed. Yet they carried within them an invisible fortress that no whip could reach. This fortress was their memory of who they were, where they came from, the patterns of their speech, the rhythm of their drums, the proverbs that shaped their worldview, and the customs that defined their dignity. On plantations and in slave quarters, when overseers thought they were merely surviving, they were in fact building quiet rebellions with every story whispered in the dark, every dance step that echoed the soil of West Africa, every lullaby sung to a child that carried the tone and structure of Igbo speech. Their survival was not just in living, but in refusing to be remade in the image of their oppressors. They turned memory into a shield and a weapon, refusing to surrender their humanity even when the world called them property. This act of holding on was itself a declaration of war against cultural erasure. Identity became their battlefield, food seasoned with ancestral recipes, hair braided in patterns that recalled old village maps, songs whose verses hid instructions for escape, and rituals performed in secret as quiet affirmations of self. They wore their heritage in ways that could not be erased because it was woven into their very being. The Igbo instinct to preserve and protect their identity meant they did not only survive slavery, they subverted it, planting seeds of resistance in every place they were scattered. Even when separated by languages, plantations, or islands, that shared pulse of memory allowed them to recognize one another, to feel less alone in the struggle, and to organize in defiance of the systems that sought to keep them broken. In this way, the Igbo identity was never just something they carried, it carried them, sustaining their spirit through centuries of oppression, enabling them to leave an unbroken legacy that can still be traced today in the voices, traditions, and movements for freedom that echo across the African diaspora. Their unyielding commitment to remain themselves, to refuse the complete theft of their essence, is one of the greatest victories in the history of human resistance. Freedom, for the Igbo, was never an abstract concept, reserved for speeches or ideals written on paper. It was a living, breathing truth that defined their worth and their very reason for existence. To live without freedom was not living, it was a slow erasure, an insult to the ancestors who had walked proudly on their own land, guided by the principles of self-determination and dignity. This belief was not learned from books but inherited through centuries of village governance, where every man and woman had a voice, where decisions were made collectively, and where no single ruler could dictate the fate of the people. When the brutal machinery of the transatlantic slave trade tore them from their homeland, shackled their bodies, and sought to shackle their minds, this inner conviction did not vanish. Instead, it burned brighter, for the very conditions of enslavement made freedom an even more sacred necessity. This is why the story of Igbo landing has survived for centuries, not merely as history, but as an unshakable statement of what the Igbo spirit believed. Faced with the prospect of living out their days in bondage, these men and women chose the open waters over chains, death over a life stripped of liberty. Their choice was not an act of despair, but a final victory of will, a refusal to let their captors claim their bodies as vessels for profit or domination. They left behind a legacy that tells every generation after them, freedom is not given, it is defended, and if necessary, it is taken at the highest cost. This principle has rippled through time, shaping movements for independence, inspiring uprisings and plantations across the Americas, and giving courage to countless souls who understood that comfort without freedom is only another form of imprisonment. Even in the face of certain death, the Igbo chose to write their own ending rather than allow an oppressor to write it for them. This was not about rejecting life, it was about preserving the essence of life, the right to exist on one's own terms. On plantations, this belief transformed into everyday acts of rebellion, working slowly, breaking tools, teaching forbidden words to the next generation, escaping into the night despite the risk. It lived in the determination of mothers who told their children, "You are more than what they call you," and in the defiance of men who refused to answer to slave names. To the Igbo, survival without self-ownership was a hollow shell, and thus they chose to either live free or not live at all. It is this clarity, this unwavering moral compass, that has made the Igbo not only survivors of one of history's darkest chapters, but architects of their own unbroken legacy. Their lesson is as relevant now as it was centuries ago. The measure of a people is not in what they endure, but in what they refuse to accept as their fate, and in that the Igbo have never bowed. The Igbo did not only resist with their bodies, they resisted with ideas, with a social order so deeply rooted in equality and mutual respect that even in foreign lands, stripped of their tools, their clothing, and their homeland, they carried within them a blueprint for freedom. This invisible architecture of liberation was not drawn on parchment or carved into stone. It lived in their memory, in the patterns of decision-making they had practiced for generations, and in the stories they whispered to each other when overseers were out of earshot. In the villages of their homeland, the Igbo thrived under a decentralized political system where power was not concentrated in a single hand, but spread among elders, lineage heads, councils, and age-grade groups. Every voice mattered. Leadership was a responsibility, not a throne. This way of life instilled a natural resistance to hierarchy and tyranny. For no Igbo person was born believing that one individual could own another. When they were forced onto ships and taken to plantations, they did not simply abandon this worldview. Instead, it became the seed from which countless acts of resistance would grow. On plantations, they recognized kindred spirits, others from the same villages or neighboring clans, and quietly recreated familiar systems. They appointed spokespeople, resolved disputes among themselves, and supported those who attempted escape. Even under the watchful eyes of those who sought to break their spirits, they found ways to pass down communal values. They organized work in patterns that subtly disrupted plantation schedules, shared food in ways that mirrored the kinship obligations of home, and taught the young ones the old proverbs that reminded them of who they were before change. Their philosophy that a human being's dignity is non-negotiable became a silent weapon, more dangerous to the institution of slavery than open rebellion alone. It was this mental and cultural framework that inspired larger coordinated acts of defiance, from work stoppages to planned escapes. Even in the brutal New World, Igbo values became a foundation for marooned communities, hidden settlements of escaped enslaved people, where governance mirrored the egalitarianism of their ancestral village. In these spaces there were no kings, only councils, no orders without consensus, no lives lived in submission. This invisible architecture meant that freedom was not just a dream of escape, but a way of living that could be built and sustained even in hostile environments. Over time, these ideas seeped into broader anti-slavery movements. Abolitionists often spoke of liberty as a universal right, but for the Igbo, this was not philosophy, it was lived reality carried across the ocean. In meetings, in secret gatherings, in the coded language of spiritual songs, they reminded each other of the truth. You cannot own a soul that knows it is free. They proved that liberation is not only achieved by breaking chains, but by refusing to accept the legitimacy of the chains in the first place. This was their quiet revolution, an unshakable framework that made every oppressive system unstable from within, showing that true freedom begins not on the day of emancipation, but on the day a person decides they will never bow. The Igbo did not only resist with their bodies, they resisted with the intangible weapons of memory, culture, and identity. Even when their wrists were shackled and their feet bled from the weight of chains, they carried with them something no whip could tear away: the knowledge of who they were. This knowledge was not an abstract concept, but a living, breathing inheritance carried in language, in music, in the rhythm of their speech, in the proverbs that had been passed from grandmother to grandchild for centuries. On the decks of slave ships, in the suffocating darkness below, some whispered the familiar words of home, speaking in the tonal rises and falls of the Igbo tongue, letting each syllable remind them that they had not been erased. Their captors may have tried to scatter them, but language bound them together, a lifeline invisible to the eye yet strong enough to outlast oceans. In the plantations of the New World, this thread of identity wove itself into everything they touched. The melodies they sang during labor were not mere songs of sorrow, they were coded messages, echoes of old war chants, praises for the ancestors, and rhythms that matched the pulse of drums once played under moonlight. Where the drum was banned, their hands clapped in syncopation, their feet stomped in patterns that mirrored the heartbeat of their villages, and their voices bent notes into shapes that only the initiated could fully understand. Each beat, each chant was a declaration that the old ways had not died. Their rituals transformed into new forms, but kept the essence of the old ones alive. In the naming of children, in the marking of seasons, in the preparation of food, fragments of home survive. A certain way of cooking yams, the use of red earth in ceremonies, the binding of cloth in specific knots, these were not random acts but quiet affirmations of identity. Proverbs rich with layered meaning became daily wisdom and subtle acts of resistance. A tree does not forget its roots, they would say, and in that single phrase lived centuries of cultural pride and the refusal to be stripped of heritage. Even when overseers forbade their gatherings, the Igbo found ways to meet in secret, in the hush of night, around small fires in hidden corners. There they would tell stories of trickster heroes who outwitted powerful enemies, of spirits who guarded rivers and forests, of ancestors who watched from the other side. These stories were not mere entertainment, they were a coded survival manual, teaching endurance, strategy, and unity. They reminded the young ones that they came from a people who had never been conquered in spirit, no matter what happened in flesh. This unbroken cultural thread stretched beyond the plantations into the maroon communities hidden deep in forests, mountains, and swamps. These were settlements of escaped enslaved people who built entire societies based on the communal values they had brought from Africa. Among them, the Igbo influence was clear: leadership without kings, decision-making by consensus, collective responsibility for the well-being of every member. They recreated the moral and social blueprint of their homeland, proving that their ways could thrive even under constant threat. Generations passed, yet the thread remained uncut. Language blended with others but retained familiar sounds and words, songs fused with new influences, yet kept their African heartbeat. Rituals adapted to new realities but still pointed back to the same ancestral source. This was not mere survival, it was transformation without surrender. The Igbo had carried across the Atlantic a complete system of thought, a worldview that valued dignity, self-determination, and equality, and they had woven it into the fabric of the Americas. Over time, these cultural remnants inspired others beyond the Igbo themselves. Abolitionist movements both within Africa and abroad drew from the example of those who had preserved their identity despite every effort to erase it. Freedom fighters found strength in the knowledge that liberation was not only a physical act but a mental and cultural one. To remain who you are when everything conspires to make you forget is the highest form of defiance. This is why the Igbo legacy is not confined to history books but lives in the voices, the dances, the celebrations, and even the everyday sayings of people across continents. It exists in the way mothers hum lullabies that carry the cadences of old rivers, in the way communities gather in circles to resolve disputes, in the way children are told that they come from greatness. The unbroken cultural thread proves that identity, once rooted deep enough, can stretch across centuries and oceans without tearing. It is the quiet, constant reminder that the spirit of a people cannot be auctioned away, and that the most enduring victories are often the ones fought in the heart and mind long before the battlefield is reached. The Igbo story is more than a chronicle of the past. It is a living reminder that freedom is never something granted, it is something claimed, nurtured, and protected with unshakable will. Their legacy is a call to action that crosses centuries, urging both present and future generations to recognize that oppression does not always arrive with chains or whips. Sometimes it hides in laws and systems, in subtle erasures of culture and dignity. The struggles faced by the Igbo were not confined to the dark hulls of slave ships or the fields of distant plantations. They continue in different forms today in the battles against economic injustice, racial inequality, and the silencing of heritage. To study the Igbo is to confront the truth that resistance is not a single event but a lifelong duty, a duty to remain awake to injustice and to act, even when the world would prefer silence. Their example teaches that courage is not just the act of running toward danger with defiance, but also the quiet, relentless work of preserving one's values, language, and traditions when those in power seek to replace them with something alien. The Igbo's endurance shows us that the first battlefield is the mind. They understood that if a people's history and identity could be uprooted, they could be controlled, even if their bodies were technically free. This understanding must be carried forward by us today. Every generation must guard its collective memory, because memory is where dignity begins. In our modern world, where cultures are diluted under the weight of globalization, where the stories of ancestors are often replaced by empty distractions, the lesson of the Igbo is clear. We must consciously choose to keep our history alive. This means telling our stories without apology, teaching our languages to our children, celebrating our festivals, honoring our heroes, and refusing to allow the narrative of who we are to be rewritten by those who never walked in our footsteps. The Igbo's resistance was not just about saying no to slavery, it was about saying yes to life, yes to identity, yes to the right to exist on their own terms. They showed that the fight against oppression is both a fight against what is wrong and a fight for what is right. This dual struggle must be embraced by all who seek justice. It is not enough to remove chains. The conditions that allowed those chains to exist must be dismantled as well. That requires active participation in shaping society through education, through economic empowerment, through cultural revival, through solidarity that crosses borders. The call to action in their story is also a call to unity. The Igbo, though fiercely independent in their villages, understood that resistance was strongest when it was shared. They formed alliances, joined maroon communities, and contributed their strength to wider movements for freedom. In our time, this means building bridges across communities and causes, recognizing that oppression against one group is oppression against all. The spirit of Igbo resistance tells us that division is the ally of tyranny, and that collective determination is the foundation of liberation. Their story tells us that the fight will not always be grand or visible. Often it will be in the quiet acts of refusal, the refusal to believe lies about our worth, the refusal to let injustice go unchallenged, the refusal to forget. And yet these small refusals, multiplied across many lives and many years, create the conditions for great change. That is the lesson they have left us. Never underestimate the power of persistence, of resilience, of simply holding fast when everything around you demands surrender. We are heirs to their courage, whether we know it or not. Each of us carries the weight and the privilege of that inheritance. To ignore it is to dishonor their sacrifices. To live it is to extend their victory into the future. Their call to action does not belong to historians or scholars alone. It belongs to every person who believes that freedom is a birthright, not a gift, and that it is our responsibility to pass it on stronger than we found it. The Igbo resisted not because it was easy, but because it was necessary. And that necessity remains. If we accept this call, if we answer with the same unbreakable spirit, then their story will not simply be something we remember. It will be something we live. And in living it, we become the next link in a chain not of bondage but of freedom, forged in courage, bound in unity, and carried forward without end. Their legacy becomes not just a chapter in the book of history, but an unending anthem, sung by all who refuse to bow, whispered by those who survive, and shouted by those who rise. This is the duty they hand to us, the torch they pass through time. And it will be ours to guard, to protect, and to carry forward, just as they carried it through the darkest nights, lighting the path for those who would come after.